Welcome back. It's a pleasure to introduce you to our second speaker. Mary Burton was born in Argentina and attended one of our ESAP schools when she was very young. She lived in Brazil, Europe, and finally settled in Cape Town, South Africa, where the story she will tell us today begins. She will take us on a fascinating journey along truth, justice, redress, and reconciliation. I would like to ask you that if you have any questions at the end of the presentation, please send us a WhatsApp and I will be very happy to share your questions with Mary. Over to you, dear Mary.
Thank you very much, Silvana. It's wonderful to be a part of this conference from so far away in Africa. Thank you for your kind introduction and welcome to everybody who's listening to this session today. So teachers here in South Africa also grapple with the question of how to teach, especially history teachers, to teach our troubled history and the past, which is really so present with us in South Africa today, and to prepare young people to live in this still very divided society, and to teach some of them in very poor, faraway, rural schools with very little facilities, very little access to the internet, and also, in a way equally difficult, to teach in privileged schools, where children are very much protected from the reality of the bigger life around them. So I think it applies to teachers everywhere in the world, but especially in South Africa, it seems to me a really important and valuable profession. So I feel very honored to be in the company of those who do that work. So I arrived in South Africa in 1961, newly married and knowing very, very little about South Africa. I'm quite ashamed to think how little I knew at the time. My husband and his family were very welcoming to me, and we lived in a very nice neighborhood. And I thought that maybe that's how my life was going to be after that. But in the 1960s, the National Party, the party that promoted apartheid, had been in power already since 1948. And it was becoming more and more powerful and imposing its policies without any opposition from the white population, which was the only one that had the vote. I shouldn't say without any opposition, but with small opposition. And Black people of any color and descriptions had no right to participate in the government of the country. But what really hit me, first of all, were two things. In my own neighborhood, for a long time, people had lived happily together of different colors. Colored people defined as colored people by the South African government, and white people living closely knit communities. But the government had now declared the area to be a white area. And so those people were being forced to move out of their homes, and in some very few cases, maybe they could afford to buy a house somewhere else and receive some compensation, very little. But mostly they were just forced out to settlements that the government had created on the periphery of the cities. And in spite of all protests, that was what was happening. And people still remember that today. And we have memorial marches sometimes from those places where people used to live, which are truly heartbreaking to take part in them. So that was a big shock for me. And the other thing that struck me was that there were night schools in the area and all around the city where people were being given an opportunity to acquire an education, to become literate, to improve their qualifications. And the government was closing them down. And in Brazil at the time, there had been huge illiteracy campaigns with students going out in the country areas, which is what I had been reporting on in the job that I had. I could not understand how any government could stop people from getting an education. But obviously they were afraid that it also had a political component to it. And so that was another thing. It made me ask more and more questions. And those questions led me to an organization called the Black Sash. And here I have a picture that shows Black Sash women on the march wearing their black sashes. The black sashes were a symbol of mourning against the loss of rights. And so I started to learn more about this organization, and then I applied to join. And that was the beginning of my real political education. I was so inspired by those women who had been active by then for about 10 years, who protested against unjust laws, who wrote articles, who demonstrated, and they were all middle-class, ordinary women, some of them wonderful academics and professionals, but people simply dedicated to trying to help to undo the injustice of the past and the growing injustices of the present. And for a long time, it looked absolutely hopeless. It didn't look as if there would be any possibility of changing things in South Africa. Many of the organizations that were represented Black people's voices had been banned, their leaders had been driven into hiding or into exile, and many of them were arrested and in jail, like Nelson Mandela himself. And there was a sort of silence, an uncomfortable silence. But by the end of the 1960s, there was a new generation rising up. And the 1970s became a period of resistance, especially in schools and universities, and marked particularly in 1976 by a very big demonstration of pupils in Black schools demanding better education. And it was a peaceful demonstration, a march through the streets, and the police broke it up with incredible brutality. People were killed, young people were killed and injured, and it marked a moment of change. And all around the country, school children began to erupt out onto the streets, and there were many, many protests and many children in mass, held together in mass groups in terrible conditions in jails and so on. And within a year after that, Steve Biko, a student leader, had been detained, was being tortured in the detention center without access to trial, and eventually died of his torture. And all of those things marked a transition from what seemed like quiet acceptance of injustice on the part of Black people to more and more visible resistance. And for a time, the Black Sash wrote about that, spoke about it, but felt very isolated in a way, living and working in mainly white areas of the country. But in the early 1980s, all of that activity led to the formation of a united national organization, where small organizations, NGOs, charitable groups, human rights agencies, and people like ourselves were suddenly swept into this broad national movement of demand for change. It marked a great shift for us in the Black Sash and for the country as a whole. And gradually the National Party became more and more on the defensive, trying to resist this change. But eventually had to recognize that it was impossible to go on keeping apartheid alive. By then, the international pressure that had been brought about by all this protest had got greater and greater, and the country was more isolated. In 1990, we had the wonderful day when the then president declared that he was going to enter into negotiations with the banned organizations, allow the exiles to come back into the country, free the political prisoners, and embark on some process towards a new constitution. And of course, we, the women of the Black Sash, were as joyous as anybody else in the country and participated in all of those debates and discussions over the next few years. We thought it would happen very quickly, but it took almost 4 years until we had new elections, the first ever really democratic elections in South Africa, and Mandela was elected as our new president. And those were moments of great dreams and beliefs that everything would be wonderful and progress would continue from then on. which to some extent it did. I mean, it is fantastic that now in South Africa, we have elections for local government coming up in a couple of weeks' time, and they're going to be difficult. And many of the young people are saying, what's the point of voting? It doesn't make any change. So in that sense, we're a bit like the rest of the world again. But many people still believe that the power of the vote is so wonderful that we must use the opportunity to vote for change and work for change at the same time. But one of the things that happened when we created a new constitution and brought in democratic government was that we had to deal with the past. There was no way that you could build a peaceful and reconciled country when there was so much damage done in the past. And there were many discussions about how that would happen. The negotiations within the political parties had led to a promise that there would be some kind of amnesty. And many of us were horrified at the idea that there could be an amnesty for the brutality and the illegality of the government actions of the past. But we had to accept that that had been part of the price of the negotiations. And so the question was how to deal with the past. And out of all those discussions and conversations about how we might manage that, it was agreed that we would create in South Africa a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That was in the early years of President Mandela's term of office, and he pushed for that very hard together with the new Minister of Justice. And the commission was set up with the mandate to uncover the atrocities that had been committed by the apartheid state, but also any violations of human rights that had been caused by the liberation movements or people who may not have been officially part of them, but who were in favor of the change of government. And that commission was established, and President Mandela set it up, and I was asked to be part of it. And at first, I didn't think that I had the capacity, but we all had to do what we could. So I did join the commission, and it was an amazing opportunity. Very, very sad, very hard, very difficult to listen to the stories of victims of apartheid and victims of other incidents that had taken place, and try and find some ways to work towards reconciliation. It's a process which is never perfect, and there is still today much criticism of it as having allowed people who had committed terrible offenses to get away with it. But nevertheless, it does at least reveal a good part of the truth of what happened during those years. And it remains a record that people must say, we took the same slogan from Argentina. We said, nunca más, never, never, and never again. Mandela used those words. Never, never, and never again shall there be a government that will oppress its people like that. But the term of office of Mandela came to an end. We had a new government. People began to forget about the past. White people began to sit back and feel that they didn't have to worry about their positions of privilege anymore because there was freedom. And here we are still with mass poverty, with people living in shanty towns and in shacks, and with our schools still very unequal from privileged to underprivileged, and so much work still to be done, and seemingly not enough consideration on the part of the authorities or on the part of those who are privileged to be willing to change. So we can say we achieved the truth to some extent, and maybe even a form of justice to another. And we acknowledged that reparations had to be made. The people who testified before the commission, a large proportion of them applied for reparations, financial reparations, and received it. But there's no way that national reparations for the whole population have been done. And certainly not the reconciliation has been done. And one of the great disappointments has been that it was assumed that if people who had carried out tortures and killings and things like dumping people in the ocean, which we also learned from Argentina, I believe, that people who were seen as opponents were tortured, and then they were tortured so badly that they couldn't be set free, and their bodies had to be disposed of, and all of those terrible things that have come to light. Many of those people never even took the opportunity to apply for the amnesty that was offered, a kind of hand of friendship and forgiveness that was offered. And we assumed that those people, some of whom had been identified through the Truth Commission process by the statements of victims or families of victims, would then be prosecuted. But by then, the government had lost enthusiasm and the capacity, and the prosecuting authorities had become corrupted under a good deal of corruption in the government. And so that remains unfinished business for South Africa. And many people would just wish that it would go away and we could start afresh, but it won't go away unless we deal with it. And so there are some small organizations still not as well resourced or as well known as they should be, who are working away at trying to get that work done, keeping pressure on the government, trying to clean up our national prosecuting authorities so that we remove the people who are corrupted and who may have been implicated themselves in the past in order to bring about justice. And then there is the question for the rest of the country. What do we do about making up for what was done under apartheid? Not so much only the crimes, but the fact that we who are mainly white, not any longer, there are also Black people now who have jobs and have money. We live lives of privilege, whereas the majority of our country are poor, unemployed, inadequately educated, and have very little hope for the future. We can't talk about reconciliation. We can't talk about redress until we do something about that. So the campaigns now have to be to build all over again. And maybe that's part of history, that each generation has to build all over again. You can take steps forward each time. Of course we do take steps forward. But there is always work to be done when there has been injustice. And so, day by day, the work goes on to look at trying to make good for the past, repair the past in terms of justice issues, so that we uphold our constitution and we prosecute and bring to justice people who have committed crimes, but also so that we look at creating a better balance between the people of our country who remain behind, who have not been part of the birth of a new society, and who have lost hope to a very great extent. And that work has to go on. So that's really what I believe about reconciliation, is that it is impossible for it to be claimed until we have undone the inequalities of the past. And I will stop there for the moment and see if there are questions, which I'm very happy to enter into discussion with people. So I'll stop for the moment.
There are a couple of questions. One of them has to do with you being a white woman and how this was seen at the time, a white woman defending the right of Black people. Was this, how did this process, was this accepted by the locals? How were you involved? Which was the process?
Well, the white women's group that I belonged to in the first place was very much criticized by other white people. We were very much disliked by many organizations, by many people. We were certainly seen as the enemy by the government. And it was risky, but it was not as risky as life was for Black people who opposed the government. Because being a white woman still gave you a degree of protection. So there was that kind of imbalance in a way, that you were standing up, you were taking a risk, but the risk was not nearly as great as that people who were not white experienced. The problems that most of us in the Black Sash experienced was people worried about their husbands' jobs. We have to realize that women's positions in society were quite different in the 60s, and many of them were housewives, or if they were professional women, their own jobs were also at risk. And so there were that kind of risk. It was only later that some of our younger members were arrested and detained and so on for the work that we were doing. People like me, for instance, I was not a South African, and I had to think about that, both personally, what right did I have to be active when I was not a born citizen, and also there was always the risk of deportation. And much later, through the Truth Commission, I discovered that in fact the government had considered deportation, but they didn't do that, and it would have been, I think, politically costly for the government to do that. And my children had a tough time at school and that sort of thing, but I don't think it did them any very serious harm. In a way, the most difficult thing was that even those women who had had close friendships with some of the Black leadership, who had then either gone into hiding or into exile or were imprisoned, found themselves separated from those people. And at one time, we used to try and organize meetings together jointly to draw Black women closer into our organization and so on. It was very difficult, and it was more dangerous for them than for us. So we felt very isolated. And that is why when the United Front was created in 1980s, for us it was absolutely wonderful, because since the commitment was to non-racialism, people like Black Sash members and white students and so on and activists were those who were immediately embraced by the broader Black movement now. And that was a beginning for us of a sense of what a new South Africa might look like as we worked together.
I see. You were a newly married, a very young woman, falling in love for a South African, I would say, entrepreneur. And did this bring any problems in the family? I mean, you were bringing up your children, and now you're a grandmother. Did this affect it personally? Did you have to make any, I would say, negotiation with your family?
I was very lucky in that my husband was not really politically interested, but he was always a very good church person. And through his own activities in the church, he had met people of different races. So he was more open-minded, or more open to understand than many other people might have been. For his parents, it was not so easy. And there we just had to work our way through it. And there were times when it was hard and when it was difficult. But we never had a complete break in our family. But within the Black Sash movement, there were people who had a very difficult time keeping their work separate from their family lives, and who never wanted to be in the public demonstrations or have their names in the newspaper for fear of what their husbands and families would say. So it all was quite difficult.
I see. One of the questions from the audience is when did you leave? When did you last leave Argentina? Whether you were able to be in Argentina during the 70s, during the dictatorship we had?
No, what happened was that I came here in the 60s, and by then my parents had lived in Brazil. And so when I did have opportunities to visit them, I went to Sao Paulo rather than to Buenos Aires. So very seldom. I think once or twice, maybe just to see my grandparents, but not to be aware really of what was happening in the Argentine, or only what I read and followed.
Yes. You've been, you traveled, you've been in Brazil, you studied in Europe, finally, very different cultures, and then finally settling in South Africa. Did this, I would say, journey through different continents in a way helped you settle and understand the reality? In which way did it contribute to your interests in life?
I don't think I could have stayed and lived in South Africa if I had not had some way of negotiating living under apartheid. And when I had been in the Black Sash for a few years, and I was beginning to be asked if I would take some leadership positions in the organization, I felt very inadequate because I didn't know enough about South Africa. I had tried to learn both Afrikaans, the language of the Dutch settlers in South Africa, and Xhosa, which is the African language which is spoken in my area. But still, I didn't feel that I knew enough. And I had not ever had a chance to go to university. And so then when my youngest child started school, I applied to our local university, the University of Cape Town, to study there. And that was a wonderful time for me. So I studied politics and studied some African government and anthropology and that sort of subject. And then I studied English just for the joy of the literature and reading and so on. And it was a wonderful time. And it did make me feel much more aware, and I knew more of the history and how complex this society is. And that helped me a great deal too. And it gave me more confidence in speaking about events.
When you raised your children and now your grandchildren, and in a way, you can see the future that awaits them, which are the things that you want them really to know about life, or the message as a grandmother that you would like to give to them after all this, I would say, life and adventurous experience that you've gone through?
Well, I'm very thankful to say that my 4 sons grew up. They may have had some difficult times, but they have grown up to be men who are aware and interested and care a lot about the future of South Africa. The way things are now in South Africa, but I think the way things young people are everywhere, if they have an opportunity to travel and explore. My grandchildren are, some of them are now leaving university and they have dreams of going to study in other parts of the world and do further degrees or work and also learn about the world. So none of them has been really politically active, but they are people who are willing and more than willing, keen to see South Africa survive and grow as a multi-racial, multicultural country. And I think all of us believe that given a chance, South Africa has something to teach the world. This is a fascinating country and a fascinating continent. And if we can get it right here, it will be a model. And there were times when we already thought so. And then we started to make the same mistakes that other places have made. But we still believe that South Africa has a great future if we can turn it around and put it back on track.
And one last question, out of all these fascinating things, which are the 3 things that you think impacted on yourself when growing and living in South Africa? 3 fascinating things that have shaped you as a person.
Well, firstly, I think role models. Some of those older women, I'll show you another picture of the first generation of Black Sash members. And you can see how old-fashioned they look, but in those days, they could stand in mass groups and they had huge courage and huge confidence, and they really inspired a young woman like me to believe that you could make a useful contribution. So I think that was very important for me. another very big event, and quite early on in our history, was that the prisoners who were on Robben Island with Mandela, some of them had lost their family members, lost contact with them, or their families had given up waiting for them to come out of prison and perhaps given up hope. And some of those people received no visitors. And in the end of the 1980s, when the laws were beginning to change, they could have visitors who were not family members. And so I had the opportunity to go and visit and see what it was like for a prisoner to be on Robben Island and receive a visit. And it made a very lasting impression on me. So I think that was a dose of reality further than I had already reached. I think we may be running out of time, so if you want to stop me, that's fine.
Mary, it's been a pleasure listening to you, to your story, the journey, the personal journey you've gone through, and the family you were able to raise. Especially, I would like to thank you because of your inspiring words and devoting time there in South Africa for us teachers and heads in Argentina. And it's been a pleasure listening to you. My deepest gratitude, and thank you so much for joining us in this conference.
Thank you, Silvana, and thank you for inviting me to participate.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much. And now it's time to go back to the exhibit hall, and some people are asking me how to get there. You go back to the home, and if you scroll down on the website, you can click and decide which digital stand you would like to visit. There are many to visit, so just go to the home, scroll down, and click on the digital stand you would like to visit. See you back in 10 minutes, and we're going to meet Will Ord.